Hey everybody, get ready for 1 Corinthians chapter 4. So sit tight, we will be right back. Welcome to Knock Talk. I am your host, William Hall, broadcasting live out of Kingsland, Texas, USA, with another episode of A Rabbi Cross-Examines the New Testament with Rabbi Michael Skobac from Canada. Tonight, 1 Corinthians chapter 4. Welcome back, Rabbi Skobac. Oh, let's go back to... Oh, man. I didn't realize it either, but you're right. It's so easy to fit that in on so many different levels. Oh boy, that's okay. It's a good name to fit in. It's not like slipping up saying, dropping a different bomb, So it's a good holy name, a holy word to be saying. So, welcome back, Rabbi. So
great to be back.
Yes, indeed. Indeed. So excellent. So tonight, 1 Corinthians 4, and we want to see what you got in store for us.
So welcome to the month of June.
Hey, we made it.
Springtime.
Yes, indeed. Of 110 degrees, yeah.
But wait, there's more.
Oh.
So I have to confess, when I was trying to study this chapter, I fell asleep several times. It's not the most exciting chapter in Corinthians, and as I pointed out before, that even David Stern's commentary doesn't seem to have a lot to say about some of these chapters. They're sort of bland.
Gotcha.
But everyone should stay tuned, because next week Paul is going to have his sex chapter. So
right. Yeah.
So things will heat up.
Yeah, that'll be the PG-13 these days. Right?
Probably.
Yeah, for sure. Good deal. All right.
So we'll see what we can extract from this week's chapter.
So what about so just in general for over the past few of the past month or so, these last 4 or the last 3 chapters, I guess if you could sum all of it up to date, how would you express that?
Well, first of all, the letter to the Corinthians, at least the first letter to Corinthians, he's doing a lot of scolding, and it seems to be a church that has challenges. The people seem to be spiritually immature, and this letter seems to be a letter where he's doing a lot of correcting, and he does some teaching as well. But in this chapter, he's going to continue basically scolding them for being arrogant and full of themselves. And it's basically what's been going on, and it's been a general theme so far in the book of Corinthians, is Paul trying to, help steer, this very immature church. And they seem to be, in the past weeks, they were getting into personality issues, and which teachers are really the teachers that they're going to follow, and which teachers are they loyal to? Are they loyal to Paul? Are they loyal to Apollos? And they're getting caught up in personality cults. They're getting caught up in maybe you even call it competition, or just very what he refers to as earthy, fleshy, things of the world, so to speak. And that's been so far what his concern has been, is how to help the Corinthians, who are very much spiritually immature and still caught up with things of the world, very worldly things, to bring them to spiritual maturity. And so, this chapter that we're going to be doing tonight, he really continues along the same theme, and that's why I didn't find this particularly exciting. But we'll have a few points to discuss. and he begins out of the starting gate by speaking of the teachers, I suppose, and the apostles and the teachers of, what he calls, he refers to them as the servants of the Messiah. That's one of the questions I'll be going into tonight is, are they really truly servants of the Messiah? I mean, they like to see themselves as this. But Paul starts off by asking the Corinthians to think about who their teachers are. And the teachers, Paul emphasizes, they're not just teachers, they're not just like, football stars, but they are servants and stewards of what Paul calls the mysteries of God. And I find it a very interesting term that he uses, because it's definitely what you could call a New Testament term, much more so than you could call than you would find in the Hebrew scriptures in the Tanakh. Going back already to Jesus, you find, he is a bit cryptic and he's a bit mysterious. First of all, throughout his ministry, Jesus is telling his disciples to, keep a lot of things undercover. He tells them a number of times, look, don't tell anybody I'm the Messiah, which is interesting because you would think that that's the kind of thing he wanted to publicize. And he does. He sends out emissaries to spread the word. But at the same time, he's a bit cagey, and he tells them, look, don't reveal that I'm the Messiah. He tells them in many cases, don't tell anybody I did these miracles. So he himself, Jesus, seems to be a bit cagey. I mean, on a simple level, it's not hard to understand why he would have told his followers to keep things under wraps, because he knew full well that if his movement became too well known, then it would draw the attention of the Romans, and they would snuff him out, as they did. So, he would have a very, very powerful reason for wanting to keep things a little bit under wraps. But, when we studied Matthew, we saw that that's a very difficult line to walk, because, the Gospels keep on telling us how incredibly popular Jesus was, and that word was spreading about him all over the place. So perhaps even though he tried to keep things on the QT, word got out anyway. We know that, loose lips sink ships, and ultimately that's what happened to him. Although, he certainly played a big part in it, because at least according to the Gospels, he's the one that marches into Jerusalem during the Passion Week on a donkey, and having, received all these people greeting him as the Messiah, son of David. So it's hard to understand, fully the behavior of Jesus. But he does, in just very few passages, play up this idea of mysteries. There's a famous passage which appears in several of the Gospels, where his followers ask him, look, why is it that everything you teach is in parables? As an example here, I have in Mark chapter 4, verse 10. So it says, when he was alone, those who were around him, along with the 12, asked him about the parables. They wanted to know, what's the deal with all these parables you're telling us? And he said to them, to you has been given the secret of the kingdom of God. But for those outside, everything comes in parables, in order that they may indeed look but not perceive, and they may indeed listen but not understand, so that they may not turn again and be forgiven. It's a passage really worth studying when we get back to the Gospel of Mark. But, you find the same thing really in more or less in Matthew chapter 13. And you have here Jesus, basically saying that not just his behavior, but what he taught was often unclear and mysterious on purpose, because he did not want too many people to be exposed to exactly what he was teaching. He wanted to keep what he refers to as the mysteries here under wraps, and to keep it within a small group. But Paul is the one that is really caught up constantly with the idea of revealing mysteries. Paul writes in Romans that there were mysteries that existed since the beginning of time, and Paul gives the impression that there were things that in the Hebrew scriptures, in the Tanakh, were not really revealed or not fully revealed, but these ideas are coming forth and being fully explicated in his teachings. And so Paul is constantly referring to, throughout his writings, to these ideas of mysteries that are being revealed. And I thought about this for a while, because again, it's a big theme. It's a major theme, especially in the writings of Paul. And when I think about the Tanakh, when I think about the Hebrew scriptures, especially the 5 books of Moses, which is the foundation of everything, it's really not presented as mysterious or secretive. God specifically says that when I speak to Moses, I don't speak in riddles. God reveals himself clearly, because the word Torah itself means instructions, and it was given clearly because it tries to give us clear instructions. Now, the Torah primarily is a book of instruction. There is very, very little theology in the Torah itself. There's very little philosophy or theology, so there's not even much room for getting mysterious on us. But the tone, at least, I would say, the tone of the Tanakh is pretty straightforward, and it doesn't try to be mysterious. It doesn't try to be secretive or puzzling. And yet, this idea of being mysterious and cryptic and puzzling and presenting things not clearly but in riddles and in parables is really a major feature of the Christian Bible. As a matter of fact, in 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 16, it says that many of Paul's teachings are actually difficult to understand. So here you have Paul as really the primary teacher, if you will, in the Christian Bible. I mean, some people believe that Paul wrote 13 of the 27 books in the New Testament. Others say we only know definitively about 7 that he wrote. But, that's more than anyone else. And clearly, everyone else was impacted by what Paul taught. So here you have the primary teacher, the major teacher in the Christian Bible, and we're told that the Christian Bible itself tells us that, a lot of what Paul teaches is just simply difficult to understand. And I believe that anyone that picks up a New Testament and tries to read through many of the writings of Paul will not really have an easy time understanding everything. And so I believe that this is a major contrast between the Greek scriptures, which are shrouded in mystery, and the Tanakh, and especially the Chumash, the 5 books of Moses, where God presents himself pretty clearly. Now, one of the things that Paul says is that, as a teacher, and I think he's speaking for not just himself, but he seems to be speaking for all teachers and all the apostles, is that, obviously, their listeners will judge them and evaluate them. And Paul says that, he's really not that interested in what other people think of him. He says very boldly that the only thing that matters to me is what God thinks of me, which is a very religious thing to say. And it's interesting that it seems from not just here in 1 Corinthians 4, but it seems throughout the Christian Bible they really believed that Jesus was going to come back any moment and make things clear. So he says here in verse 5, therefore judge nothing before the time until the Lord comes. And you get the sense when you read this passage that, you know, he didn't think that Jesus was coming in 1,000 years or 500 years, that the perspective of the writers of the Christian Bible was that they believed Jesus was really just around the corner. And so, you know, Paul is saying, look, everyone can have their opinions about me and about the other apostles, but, you know, your opinions don't mean much. It's really what, you know, God believes. And again, you know, this is a proper thing for people to say. The only question is, how does Paul know God's evaluation? And I think it's not just applying to Paul. I think this applies to, you know, many Christians in their spiritual life. Many Christians, you know, believe that, you know, the only important thing is, you know, what is God's evaluation of them and their spiritual walk. But Paul clearly says it about himself. And so the question that I'm thinking of is, well, how does Paul or anyone else know what God's evaluation of them is? And I think that for many Christians, and for Paul as well, it becomes a bit circular, meaning that it's based upon a subjective sense of what they assume God's position would be. I mean, I've met many Christians who tell me that, you know, the Holy Spirit spoke to them, or the Holy Spirit revealed to them, or they'll even use language like God spoke to them or God revealed something to them. And my deepest sense is that what really is transpiring is that these are their inner thoughts and their inner subjective evaluations, that they are rubber stamping with Holy Spirit, meaning that I don't think that these are people that are experiencing prophecy the way Moses experienced prophecy or the way Isaiah experienced prophecy. I believe that, you know, Paul may have been, you know, in his own mind a sincere spiritual person, but I think that his sense of what God was approving of was really a subjective internal sense of what he assumed was God's position. Again, Paul always claims that Jesus spoke to him or God revealed himself to him, but I don't think that's what happens with Paul, and I don't think that's what happens with most Christians. I believe they have an inner sense, an inner voice, and they simply assume that's the voice of God or the voice of the Holy Spirit. So when we go on in the chapter, Paul says something fascinating in verse 6. He says, now these things, brethren, I have figuratively transferred to myself and Apollos for your sakes, that you may learn in us not to think beyond what is written, that none of you may be puffed up on behalf of one against the other. Now, all the commentaries to Corinthians here wonder what he's referring to when he says not to think beyond what is written. And my research seemed to show that most readers of the Christian Bible assume that what Paul means here is what is written in the Hebrew Scriptures. Again, because there was no New Testament at when Paul wrote to the Corinthians. So I, you know, as a non-Christian, as a rabbi reading this, I say, well, this is very interesting. So does Paul really mean that if something is not in the Tanakh, then it should be disregarded? Is he really telling the Corinthians that, you know, they shouldn't think out of the box, and that box is what is written in the Hebrew Bible, what's written in Tanakh? If that's what he means, you know, it's very clear that he's shooting himself in the foot, because it presents a serious problem. You know, we've already seen in the book of Romans that Paul mangles in a very, very extreme way, not minor passages in the Tanakh, but Paul completely mangles central and critical passages in the Tanakh. For example, we saw, to me, the most egregious example is Romans chapter 10, where Paul has an entire homily about the Torah, about the law, what he calls the law, and he takes Deuteronomy 30, and he basically he transforms this incredible chapter. I mean, I think that if you wanted to, find a top 10 list of the Tanakh, Deuteronomy chapter 30 would really be way up there. It's important for so many reasons. It has critical information about the redemption and about the Messianic age and about the role and the importance of the Torah and the commandments. So Paul takes this chapter where anyone reading it will see that the context of the chapter is the centrality of the commandments and the importance of keeping the commandments, and more importantly, and the possibility of keeping the commandments, meaning that God's assurance that it's not too difficult to keep the commandments. So here, this is one of the most important chapters in the entire Tanakh, where God says to Moses that the Torah, right, is near to you in your mouth and in your heart, that you can do it. And Paul totally mangles this chapter into a homily, basically saying that the commandments are not doable, and therefore all that's important is faith, is having faith, as opposed to the performance of the commandments. So, when Paul says that you shouldn't think out of the box, and that box is the Tanakh, he's a very poor example himself. I mean, it's like, listen to what I say, not what I do. And the other example that pops into my mind is from Romans chapter 11 in verse 26, where he totally mangles an important passage in the book of Isaiah chapter 59. And what's significant is that in mangling this passage in Isaiah, Paul uses this to redefine the entire concept of the Messiah. So whereas Isaiah says that the Redeemer will come, and he will come to those among the people of Jacob who have turned away from sin. So Isaiah assumes that it's possible for people to turn away from their sins and to repent. Paul twists that, and Paul says in Romans 11 that the Redeemer will come and he will remove sin. He will remove ungodliness from Jacob. Because in Paul's theology, we're not able to turn away from our sins. We are under the we're under the control of Satan, and we're not able to live a holy life. We're not able to live lives in obedience to God. We're not able to turn away from our sins. And that's why for Paul, the Redeemer, the Messiah, doesn't come to people who've turned away from sins, because Paul doesn't believe that's possible. So Paul transforms the entire concept of the Messiah as someone who comes to basically cure human beings of their sin problem. And so I find it just incredible that Paul warns the Corinthians here not to think beyond what is written. And I think that he really means what is written in the Tanakh. So it's an incredible thing for him to say. And it's interesting that throughout this chapter and really elsewhere, Paul assumes, again, this is an assumption that he actually states outright, and he assumes that he is loyally following God. That's Paul's operating position, that I am someone who is loyally following God. And of course, this is just an assumption that he's making. It's a claim that he's making. How are we to verify this claim? And so if you want to verify it based upon, his own words here, right? I mean, is he someone who is being faithful to the words of the Tanakh? Is he someone that's not going beyond what is written in the Tanakh? I think he fails here. Also, we have to remember that back in the second chapter of this book of Corinthians, Paul said that all he really knows, meaning that the entire focus of Paul's teaching is the idea of a crucified Messiah. And again, that is something which does not emerge clearly from the pages of the Tanakh. It's more of an invention of Paul. And again, so, if we're going to judge Paul based upon the criteria that he sets up, he does not pass as far as I'm concerned. Moving on in the chapter, beginning in verse 8, Paul starts to beat the Corinthians up for their haughtiness. He gets a little bit sarcastic with them. He's a bit sarcastic in his rebuke, although later on in the chapter he'll say that he really, he loves them and he cares for them. But, they're in for a little bit of rough treatment in this chapter because he is a bit sharp and sarcastic with the Corinthians, accusing them of basically being puffed up, being arrogant, being haughty. And those are very serious charges. I mean, it's interesting that for a spiritual person who tries to live a life of godliness, arrogance is just about one of the worst sins. In the Talmud, the sages say, they're sort of paraphrasing what God would say. God would say, there isn't room enough in the world for me and an arrogant person. Meaning that a person that's arrogant basically is pushing God away, pushing God out, because they're basically overextending their own ego into the world. So to accuse the Corinthians of haughtiness and arrogance and being puffed up it's strong. It's a strong critique. And what he ends up doing is interesting. Paul basically begins to present himself and other teachers as suffering servants. Paul sees himself as a servant of Jesus, and Paul in this chapter goes into how much he has suffered, in this role, and he speaks about his suffering. We saw it in the book of Romans, we saw it in Acts, and Paul was in for persecution, and Paul was in for rough treatment. Again, I think as we saw, it was often stuff that he brought upon himself because he seemed to be a difficult character, a difficult person to get along with, and I think he really provoked a lot of people into anger. But Paul writes in this chapter here in 1 Corinthians 4 about how much he suffered and how much he was dishonored and how much, they allude to, it's not really clear, some of the commentaries allude to the fact that he compares himself to those people who were taken to the Colosseums and torn apart by the animals. That's how bad it got for them. And, so just on the topic of the arrogance of the Corinthians, I think maybe many people listening to the show might resonate with them, but sometimes this kind of arrogance we find it happens with baby believers in their enthusiasm and zeal. As people, just are new in the faith, and they're all excited and they get all caught up with the Spirit. And I think all of us have probably ran into people like this who, in their newfound faith and their zeal and in their enthusiasm, they can get a little bit cocky and arrogant and, like they're know-it-alls. And I think that's sometimes natural. And we know that, again, the Corinthians were an immature church. They were probably, not having gone through many years of discipleship. So it's not too hard to imagine them as being possibly puffed up or, feeling that they were bigger than they really were. On the other hand, it may have been an observation that Paul was seeing in these people, because as we go through 1 Corinthians, we're going to see that, these people had a lot of issues. Not only were they competitive, and they were earthly, and they were fleshy. They seemed to be, into a lot of things that just were totally out of character for spiritual people, including their sexual morality. And so, it's possible, as I mentioned last time we met, that, these may have been, a really rough group of people who had very poor character traits. And they didn't go away simply because they could run around screaming they believed in Jesus. Sometimes the most religious people are the most obnoxious and crude people. And so, either, they were innocent babes and, new believers who just had this, newfound zeal and enthusiasm that sort of spilled over into, thinking they were bigger than they really were, or it was, an expression of really how low these people might have actually been. And one of the things that I was wondering about in this passage is when Paul cites his suffering, is he citing this suffering as a certification of his credentials? One of the things that Dr. James Tabor writes about in his book, Paul and Jesus, is that Paul really did see himself as like a second Jesus, as like almost a Jesus and mini Jesus. And, Dr. Tabor shows in many of the passages in Paul's writings that he had sort of this Jesus complex about him. And, part of it played out in his suffering, because for him, the fact that Jesus suffered, well, if he's a servant of Jesus, then he as well should be suffering. So, Paul might have seen his suffering as bolstering his credentials as an apostle, and as really bolstering his legitimacy, meaning that somehow the fact that Paul has suffered so much for what he taught in his own mind proves, his legitimacy and his, credentials. But I think it's far from clear how that really proves anything. There are, as we all know, many people who suffer greatly for their faith, and it doesn't prove their faith is correct or their faith is true. But it seems that in Paul's mind, at least, this is important. So as we're going to wrap up tonight, Paul now changes his tone in verse 14. Right, he says that I'm not writing these things to shame you, right? But you're my beloved children. He speaks very tenderly in the end of the chapter, and what he says, starting in verse 16, he says, "I urge you," Paul says to them, "to imitate me." He says in verse 17, "For this reason I have sent Timothy to you, who is my beloved and faithful son in the Lord, who will remind you of my ways in the Messiah, as I teach everywhere in every church." So Paul, first of all, he speaks about my ways in the Messiah, and he urges the Corinthians to imitate him. And I think in this chapter in general, he's urging them to imitate and to follow, all true apostles and all true teachers. So one of the questions that's very obvious is, we know how all the other apostles became apostles. All the other apostles knew Jesus, walked with Jesus, studied with Jesus, lived with Jesus, and Jesus personally appointed them as apostles. But who said that Paul's an apostle? So we know that Paul simply claims that Jesus appointed him. Paul claims that Jesus appeared to him on the road to Damascus and appointed him as an apostle to the Gentiles. And, it's interesting that Paul seems to have an attitude throughout the Greek scriptures. Not only is he an apostle, but that he seems to really think of himself as an apostle that's even higher than the other apostles, because they only knew the terrestrial Jesus. They only knew, the Jesus who was earthly. But Paul feels that he's in touch with the risen Jesus, the extraterrestrial Jesus, so to speak, the heavenly Jesus. So on the one hand, Paul seems to think that his credentials are even greater. And secondly, he is constantly putting down the other apostles. He refers to them very sarcastically. We'll see in some of his writings. He calls them super apostles, meaning that he seems to speak about the other apostles in very sarcastic terms. And so all you have really when it comes to Paul's credentials as an apostle are his own claims to being one. And, it's similar to what it took to be a prophet in the Tanakh. A prophet did not become a prophet simply because they claimed to be a prophet, because we know that every false prophet claimed to be a prophet. To be a prophet, a person had to really be accepted by those people who were appointed by God as the gatekeepers, meaning that God appointed the leading sages of every generation as the gatekeepers who would make these kinds of decisions. They would ultimately decide who is a false prophet and who is a true prophet. And so when it comes to passing the gatekeepers, it's far from clear that Paul was really ever accepted by the other apostles as an apostle. There's a desperate attempt in the New Testament to create that impression, but there's an equally strong indication that there was tremendous tension between Paul and the actual apostles of Jesus, the disciples of Jesus, who were based in Jerusalem after Jesus was crucified. And we know that in the 2nd century, the Hebrew Christians, meaning the Jews that maintained their faith in Jesus into the 2nd century, they were called either Ebionites or Nazarenes. They really rejected Paul. They didn't accept him at all. And so there seems to be evidence that Paul's credentials as an apostle are not that clear. And secondly, Paul says that he should be imitated because of his ways in the Messiah. Now, those are very telling words, because I think that to a great extent that's exactly what Paul was peddling, his ways, as opposed to really the ways of Jesus. Because one of the things that we, I think, see pretty clearly, at least my reading of the Gospels, is that Jesus was someone who taught that his followers should be faithful to observing the Torah, and not just the Torah, but the teachings of the sages, and emphasized the importance of following the Torah. And actually, we see that him and his followers did observe the Torah. And even after his death, they continued going to the temple in Jerusalem and offering sacrifices, and they were pretty much, Torah observant Jews. As opposed to, it seems, Paul's theology, where Paul clearly says, that even though he advises his students when they're going to the Jews, and he says it about himself. We'll see in Corinthians, he says when he deals with the Jews, he puts on the clothing of a Jew. He comes as a Jew. Mm-hmm. He comes as someone who's under the law, as someone who follows the Torah. He says, even though he says, I'm not under the law. And Paul's constantly saying that you're no longer under the curse of the law. And, again, we saw that none of Paul's students really felt it was important to follow the Torah. And that was pretty clear for centuries and centuries and centuries. The church, did not in any way whatsoever find that it was important to be Torah observant. So, Paul saying here that his followers should imitate him and his ways in the Messiah are strange because, again, Paul never met Jesus. Paul never really quotes any teachings of Jesus. Paul never recounts any of the stories in Jesus' life. All Paul really talks about is the fact that Jesus, was crucified and died for the sins of the world, and that's more or less all he teaches about Jesus. And so that's really what you have. You have Paul's personal spin on what his significance was, who he believed Jesus was, what he believed Jesus accomplished. But it seems that there's a huge disconnect between Paul and Paul's teachings and who Jesus actually was. And I think that's one of the reasons why the apostles back in Jerusalem really were very suspicious of him, because they saw that what he was teaching was not in line with what they had heard personally from Jesus. So, my good friend, that's all I have to share on this chapter.
That was enough. That was enough.
There's a famous story. They asked Abraham Lincoln, "How long should a man's legs be?" So he said, "Long enough to reach the floor." So how long should our show be? Long enough to finish the chapter.
Exactly. That's funny. Yeah, there's this Paul character. He really is quite the confusing guy. I mean, one of my favorite verses that he had mentioned in was a very powerful one for the Messianic movement. Was in 2 Corinthians. We'll be coming up on that soon. 6:17, I think, or something like that. Let me just make sure that's even right. But he's got these scattered places where it looks like he's teaching to keep the law, and this is definitely one of them. I think it's 2 Corinthians 6:17. Let me check. Yeah, it's crazy, but it's like he's double talking, because all the stuff that you've covered, where it's really clear. Here it says, "Wherefore come out from among them and be ye separate, saith the Lord, and touch not the unclean thing, and I will receive you." In other words, if you touch the things that are unclean, he's saying, "I won't receive you." So which is it? Am I under the law, or am I not under the law?
And also we'll have to, when we study that chapter, discuss what does it mean, an unclean thing.
Okay.
In the Bible, does that refer to unkosher food?
Right.
Does that refer to the laws of ritual purity and impurity? There were things that became what we call in Hebrew tameh, ritually impure, because they either were a corpse or a dead animal or a dead rodent, or something that was touched by those things. Mm-hmm. And in the times of the temple, and we know that Paul was writing before the temple was destroyed, so in Paul's time there was a temple, and the laws of ritual purity and impurity still pertained. One of the issues obviously is that Paul was primarily teaching Gentiles who were not under the Torah. They were not required to observe these laws anyway. But the problem is, we know that even in the exile, even outside of Israel, even in places where Paul was preaching, there were Jewish communities. And so he wasn't only preaching to Gentile audiences. There were certainly Jews there as well. And, that was one of the accusations we saw in the book of Acts. He was accused of, when he was preaching, that he was preaching, not just to the Gentiles, but to the Jews who were living outside of Israel, that they shouldn't circumcise their children. They shouldn't keep the customs and, etc. So it's true that, we'll have to see what Paul meant by that. And I'm sure that, there's going to be a lot of disagreement in terms of exactly what he meant.
Right.
But my personal feeling is, and we had this come up when it came to it's going to come up to the question of how Paul saw Jesus. And one of the most confusing things about Paul's writings is exactly how he understood who Jesus was. Did Paul see Jesus as God literally in the flesh, and he saw Jesus as God, as let's say a contemporary one of today's evangelical Protestants would say that Jesus is, just as much as God as the Father is, and etc.? Or did Paul distinguish between God and Jesus and simply see Jesus as some kind of elevated being, or an intermediary to God? So I think what we've seen so far, and I've tried to point this out every single time it's come up so far, is that Paul has consistently distinguished between Jesus and God, and I think he's very consistent about that. But there are a couple of places where you sort of say, well, what about this and what about that? So I think that we're left with clearly something that's not clear, because he does seem to be inconsistent. And my personal feeling is, and this is, I guess, maybe the rabbinic side of me, that you have to go with the flow. You have to go with the thrust of what he generally says. And that if there are some exceptional passages, you have to basically plug them into the way he normally speaks. And it may require some spinning of those passages, or maybe they would have to think about interpreting it in a different way. But I think you're right. I think that, in many topics, not just the observance of the Torah, but in terms of how he views Jesus, and other questions like that, Paul is not 1,000% clear. And look, I think that at the end of the day, one of the reasons why you can have 30,000 Christian denominations in the world today is because the Greek scriptures, the Christian Bible, is not very clear. If it was so clear, there wouldn't be so much strong disagreement about what things actually meant.
Yeah, I totally agree. Wow. Well, we're all certainly learning a lot as we go along, that's for sure. So we'll see how things look next week. See if we can all keep what hairs I've got left on my head in them. No, it's been fun. It's been fun. Just tossing back these different concepts is I mean, even as you're speaking, I'm thinking too, Paul was not a 30-year preacher. He hadn't been preaching for 30 years before he wrote his first letter. I mean, he literally just got saved, and just started writing or talking like right away, teaching. And just about everybody I know in the past, I've listened to preachers from way back when they were younger, and listening to them preach again when they're older, and their messages changed a lot, because they've learned a lot along the way. And so I'm thinking there's got to be that dynamic there as well, where he's moved along and he's refined some of his own thoughts and is delivering it a different way, which could be causing some of the confusion as well. So it's kind of like, man, my phone is blowing up right now. Golly, I'm gonna turn that thing down next time. So it's fun to explore this, because I mean the context is incredible, to try to dive into the context. I mean, like you mentioned once before, I mean, who's his audience? Is he talking specifically to a group of Gentiles in this spot, or is he talking to Jewish people in this spot? So all that could cause his teaching to lean one way or the other, so. And if he's becoming all things to all men, so that just some might be saved, then you better know who he's talking to.
Yeah,
right.
I think you're making a good point that he is a work in progress, and that it's quite possible that his theology does evolve,
right?
Over time. So these are all some of the factors that make it difficult to understand Paul. Meaning that are the changes in message because of the different audiences, or the different times of his life, or different circumstances, or again, one of the problems is when we study the Christian Bible, some of the books we're not even certain if Paul wrote them.
Right.
So scholars of Paul try to stick to the certain letters of Paul, which there are 7. And if you ever study Professor Tabor's book, Paul and Jesus, he sticks to just the 7 undisputable letters of Paul.
Gotcha.
And that way, it's clearer. And I want to recommend, to people watching this program that, if you want to dive into some really important analysis of Paul's letters, that's a really, really wonderful resource.
Right. Yeah, he's a fascinating, and if you like one of his writings, then you'll certainly like all of them. And he's got quite a few. So, yeah, James Tabor, he's awesome.
By the way, let me just make one more commercial.
Certainly.
As a Tabor.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because I speak to a lot of people who are struggling with their Christian faith, and many people who have moved on from it and are now trying to find their way spiritually. And I've always recommended that they get their hands on his little book called Restoring Abrahamic Faith. And it's such an incredibly important resource, because I think that what he does in that book is to show biblically, what a spiritual life can look like for someone who's not Jewish. And his premise is that, in the book of Genesis, you have, people, the family of Abraham, who lived before there was a Torah, before there was a Judaism. And, what was their spiritual life like? How did they have a relationship with God? And this book, I have recommended to hundreds of people, and everyone has told me it's been a tremendous benefit to them spiritually. So, Restoring Abrahamic Faith by James Tabor. You should not go without this book.
Yeah, I've got it. It'll be on. I kind of found a copy of it. My wife had it. Where's the one? Do you have Paul and Jesus? No, it's okay. That's all right. Yeah, we actually picked up a copy of Restoring the Abrahamic Faith. I kind of showed it to people so they kind of would look for. So, all right. And before we go, also, Rabbi, your class that you're teaching, I want you to kind of plug it each week, just so people who might be watching for the first time can know about your lecture that you're doing.
Okay, so we started a new series of classes online, primarily for people who are not Jewish, but Jews are welcome. Not going to turn any people away.
Right.
And we're meeting every other Sunday just before this show. So we meet at 8 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. I think that's 7 p.m. Central Time, in a virtual classroom. And we're studying an amazing 18th century work called the Mesilat Yesharim, the Pathway of the Upright, which is a step-by-step guide to spiritual growth and character perfection. So if people are interested in the class, you have to register. We had one session already, so if anyone missed the first session, there is a recording. There will be recordings of all the classes available for people who register, and you can register at rabbiskobac.com. So it's rabbiskobac.com, and hope to see you. It's going to be next Sunday night.
Excellent. You answered that just in the nick of time. Shmuel was saying, where can we find this website, Rabbi? It's as if you were reading the chat. Very good. Well, Rabbi, it's been great. Thank you for entertaining my thoughts a little longer than what we intended. So makes us look forward even more so for next week. So hope you have a great week, Rabbi, and all you people out there, you viewers, Shavua Tov, and hope you all have a wonderful week ahead, and we'll see you on the other side. Shalom, shalom.
ביחד, חשוב מכל חשוב והכרחי להיות ביחד. איפוק זו העוצמה, ויתור זו הגדולה, השאיפה והכמיהה. אני אתה אתם תמיד תמיד כולם ביחד, חשוב מכל חשוב והכרחי להיות ביחד.